It's 49 AD, and time for Paul to go on his second mission trip. But first, to recap the last episode, we saw how 48 AD was an eventful year for the early church. After Paul and Barnabas returned to Antioch after their first mission trip, Peter joined them in Antioch and fellowshiped with the mixed Jewish and Gentile church. However, shortly thereafter, a group of Judaizers from Jerusalem came to Antioch. The Judaizers told the believers in Antioch that the Gentiles had to get circumcised and convert to Judaism to be in the church, and that Jewish believers shouldn't share a table of fellowship with any Gentile that doesn't convert. Peter listens to the Judaizers and stops sharing a table with the Gentiles in the church. Around the same time, Paul gets an update from the churches in Galatia that he and Barnabas have just planted. Like Antioch, Judaizers had gone to those churches with the same message that Gentiles must convert to Judaism, or else Jewish believers could not associate with them. In response, Paul writes his letter to the Galatians, explaining how the Judaizers' message is defeating the purpose of Christ's death and resurrection. Paul especially lets Peter have it, calling him a hypocrite for first sharing fellowship with the Gentiles and then changing course when the Judaizers rolled into town. The whole crew then heads down to Jerusalem for the Council of Jerusalem, the historic First Church Council, where a point of doctrine is officially decided. The question was closed, with James declaring that Gentiles do not have to get circumcised and follow Jewish practices to be in the church. However, to make fellowship with Jewish believers easier, Gentiles should not practice sexual immorality and not eat meat sacrificed to idols or improperly slaughtered meat, all things that were taboo to Jews. Having won this first major doctrinal battle in church history, Paul plans his second missionary trip. However, the outset of the second missionary trip has one of the more painful memories of the young church. Barnabas tells Paul he wants to bring Mark, the Mark who bailed on Paul and Barnabas shortly into the first missionary trip. Paul says, absolutely not, and he and Barnabas have a bitter, angry fight over it and part ways. Barnabas and Mark sail for Cyprus, while Paul takes Silas and heads to Turkey, known as Cilicia. For the record, this is the last time Barnabas and Mark are mentioned in Acts. Paul mentions Mark in two of his later letters, indicating that he eventually reconciled with Mark and valued his ministry. However, after many years of successful ministry and friendship, Paul and Barnabas never worked together again. Paul's plan for the second missionary trip is to revisit the churches he planted on the first missionary trip and continue to preach in what is called Asia, which is modern Turkey. As mentioned, Paul is bringing Silas along. Silas is a Roman citizen like Paul and a member of the Jerusalem church. An interesting note about Silas is that he was the one chosen to bring the official declaration letter from the Jerusalem Council to Antioch and Cilicia, which he and Paul do. As they traveled from town to town, they delivered the decisions reached by the apostles and elders in Jerusalem for the people to obey. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and grew daily in numbers. Paul and Silas head to Derbe, then to Lystra, where they pick up another traveling companion, Timothy, to whom Paul will later write 1st and 2nd Timothy. Timothy is probably in his late teens or early 20s. Paul is in his early to mid 40s, turns into Timothy's mentor, and the two grow to be long-term associates in ministry. However, the trio runs into a cold streak. They wander unsuccessfully around a vast swath of land until they make their way to Troas on the northwest coast of Turkey, where something interesting happens. During the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing and begging him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." After Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. Did you catch that? Where did the we and us come from? the first time they show up in Acts? Simple answer. Troas is where Luke, the author of Acts, joins the missionary party. The group heads to Philippi in Macedonia or Greece. They were successful in evangelizing, such as Lydia, a wealthy businesswoman who made her wealth selling purple cloth. She is baptized with all the members of her household and invites the missionaries to stay at her house. Lydia is our second example of many examples of wealthy women who financially supported the early church and opened their homes for the believers to live in and gather for worship. While in Philippi, a slave girl who earned a nice income for her owners telling fortunes followed Paul and the missionaries around, shouting at them and drawing unwanted attention. Paul gets annoyed and yells a quick exorcism at her. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to come out of her." At that moment, the spirit left her. The girl's owners are infuriated that their income stream has just dried up, so they take Paul and Silas to the marketplace, accusing them of advocating for unlawful customs. The magistrates ordered them to be stripped and beaten with rods. After they had been severely flogged, they were thrown into prison. However, God chose to intervene. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly, there was such a violent earthquake that the foundations of the prison were shaken. At once, all the prison doors flew open, and everyone's chains came loose. The jailer, thinking that all the prisoners were going to escape and he would probably be executed for letting it happen, decided that ending his own life would be preferable. However, Paul convinces him not to and baptizes the jailer and his household. In a strange twist, that morning, the city officials sent word that Paul and Silas were free to go and asked them to leave town. Instead of being happy, Paul gets angry, saying, "They beat us publicly without a trial, even though we are Roman citizens, and threw us into prison. And now, do they want to get rid of us quietly? No. Let them come themselves and escort us out." Which is exactly what the officials did with their tails tucked between their legs. It is interesting to think of how Paul was so willing to use the benefits of his citizenship to publicly shame the city officials who wronged him. From Philippi, Paul and Silas head 100 miles west to Thessalonica, the capital of Macedonia. It appears that Luke is no longer with the group as the we and us statements end. In Thessalonica, some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. However, some of the Jews were angry at Paul's message and so started a riot. They tried to find Paul and Silas but couldn't, so they went after some of the other new believers instead. As soon as it was night, the believers who had been hiding Paul and Silas smuggled them out of town and set them on the road to Berea, another 50 or so miles west. In Berea, the missionaries have a wonderfully different visit. The Berean Jews were of more noble character than those in Thessalonica, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true. As a result, many of them believed, as did also a number of prominent Greek women and many Greek men. However, the Thessalonica Jews heard that Paul's group was in Berea, so they came into town to stir up another riot. The believers sent Paul to Athens, but Silas and Timothy stayed behind with instructions to catch up with Paul as soon as possible. This is late 50 or early 51. In Athens, Paul preaches in the synagogue in the marketplace. Some Athenian philosophers don't like what he has to say, so they haul him into a meeting of the Areopagus. This is one of Paul's most famous moments. The Areopagus is a rocky hill in the middle of the city where the senior council of Athens, also called the Areopagus, would meet for civic business and hold trials. From the Areopagus, you can see the Parthenon and the buildings of the Acropolis just a few hundred yards away. At the Areopagus, Paul was on trial, maybe with actual charges or just a trial of public opinion, but he was on trial in front of the ancient Greek equivalent of the Supreme Court. The charge against him was that he was bringing foreign ideas and foreign gods to the people of Athens. Luke mocks the Athenians about this charge when he writes, "All the Athenians and all the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking and listening to the latest ideas." As in, Paul was talking just the same as the other philosophers the Athenians sit around and listen to. So, Paul defends himself in front of the Areopagus, telling them that the Athenians have covered up the truth of the one true God with their endless temples and idols of powerless gods. The Areopagus sneers at the idea of a resurrected God that Paul is preaching. However, some of those listening do wind up believing, including a member of the Areopagus named Dionysius. Also importantly, Paul wins the trial and is allowed to leave Athens. Paul now heads for Corinth and Ephesus, the second half of his missionary journey and the topic of our next video.